So over the past week, we've gotten a fair bit of interesting PlayStation 5 and Sony related news. We've heard that they're going to have a brand new focus on exclusive game. Well, I mean, actually that focus isn't new at all. They've had that focus now for, I would say, the majority of PS4's generation. So I mean, take that news how you will. But what I think is far more interesting about this is that Jim Ryan, Sony Interactive Entertainment's CEO and president, that's a mouthful, has outlined in an interview that the company is interested in future studio acquisitions. This would presumably be a play of sorts to rival Microsoft, who over the past year has really been going hard in the studio acquisitions area, and of course have been establishing their own new studios in the form of the Initiative as well. So this news I don't think is surprising, but it is nonetheless interesting that we've got the direct confirmation of interest in that area, and the fact of course that Sony is openly talking about the PS5 and their strategy so soon seemingly. I guess this continues the trend that they set with doing that Wired article a few months ago of just talking to the press about next gen. So it seems like we're going to be getting the majority of our PS5 details over the next year or so, potentially, before it's revealed through these weird interviews and articles and things like that. At least that's the way it looks like it's going. So other than establishing new studios like I just said Microsoft is doing, why don't we take a look at some of the potential companies that Sony could acquire to add to their first party lineup of studios that would then of course create exclusive games for PS5. So if they were to not just be looking into these things and were to actually pull the trigger on purchasing some studios, who would they go for? Well, I think the first one that comes up as a bit of a no-brainer, at least that I've seen a lot of people jumping to, is Insomniac, and that's simply because of the second party relationship that Sony and Insomniac have had over the years. Most recently, of course, we saw Insomniac develop the new Ratchet & Clank reboot from 2016 exclusively for PS4, and then of course Spider-Man for PS4 as well. So those are two current gen examples of Insomniac exclusive PS4 games. Although, of course, Sony does not own Insomniac. Insomniac is an independent company, not to mention one of the largest and most influential in the industry still. So because there's that existing relationship that is clearly out in the open for everyone to see, that is one of the options that people jump to for Sony nailing down Insomniac as joining the first party lineup and having for sure all their games indefinitely being Sony exclusive games. I really do not think this is going to happen. I think that Sony would be satisfied with their relationship that they have with Insomniac. I think Insomniac's most likely satisfied with the deal and agreements that they've had with individual projects already with Sony. Not to mention, I mean, a Spider-Man sequel for PS5 is 100% happening. I'm sure it's already in pre-production, or perhaps even in full development, who knows. So right there, you've already got another PlayStation exclusive game they're already working on. So in that sense, I don't see how Sony acquiring Insomniac would necessarily reap them much benefit. For Insomniac specifically, perhaps more than anyone else, it would very much be a long-term future investment to, as I said, ensure that their games always, forever are PlayStation exclusives. But when they already have that relationship, like I said, and when the chances of Insomniac's games in the future probably perhaps going to be PlayStation exclusives anyway, considering the possibility of a Ratchet & Clank sequel as well, I mean, as I said, I don't really see how this acquisition would necessarily benefit either party and how they're currently working together at this point in time anyway. There have also been a few bigger names thrown out into the mix, such as Capcom and Sega. Now obviously, Capcom, I think it's fair to say, is the far more relevant one of those two in 2019. Considering this year and this generation obviously as a whole, they've already released some of the biggest and most critically acclaimed games when you think back to Resident Evil 2 and Devil May Cry 5 earlier this year alone. Capcom are really doing well these days, they're really servicing their fans, and not that Sony wouldn't have the money to acquire them, I'm sure they would. I don't think they're necessarily too big in that respect for acquisition, but I do think that they're big enough and they're just a company I think that wouldn't be interested in being acquired, to be honest. I think they're happy with the relationship they have with the different console manufacturers. Same thing goes with Sega. And look, maybe some personal bias because I don't really care about Sega and their games and what they put out, but I just don't see how having Sonic games, for example, exclusive to Sony platforms forever is really that beneficial to Sony. I don't think the PlayStation brand can necessarily benefit that much from going, hey, we have Sonic, that's cool, right? Obviously, Sonic is still very much a very iconic franchise in the industry, but nonetheless, I don't really think that Sonic adds a lot of value to the brand, and I don't think Sony's very interested in Sonic. Not to say that Sonic is the only thing Sega does, but I think you get my point. Supermassive, the developers of Until Dawn, which was a PlayStation exclusive game that came out in 2014, I do believe, they're another option, but over the next few months they're releasing the first episode in their horror anthology series that they're doing, which is going to be available on all platforms. So I think the time has passed for a potential acquisition there. I think that if Sony was interested in acquiring them and ensuring that they get those kind of exclusive story horror games that they do, that would have occurred already when they already had that relationship clearly earlier in the console's life cycle with Until Dawn. The fact that they've moved on and they've got this new game coming out, it's going to be on all platforms, I think that's a sign that that relationship or any chance of an acquisition there is done. A very similar thing applies to Quantic Dream. They've had a relationship with Sony for much longer than Supermassive had, of course with Heavy Rain and Beyond Two Souls and then Detroit. Those were major second party exclusives for PS4. And PS3 of course. But the same thing applies. I mean, they even make the same story driven games that Supermassive made with Until Dawn. They had that relationship with Sony for years and years and years, and I think if Sony was interested they would have absolutely have pulled the trigger by now, because Quantic Dream is now shifting to more platforms as they move on to their next projects, not to mention some of the games are already out on PC as well, which were previously PlayStation exclusives. So I think that trend with Supermassive and Quantic Dream and Sony's relationship with them in the past, and Sony's clear lack of interest in acquisition with those two companies, shows quite interestingly that they don't seem to be overly interested in having exclusive story-driven games of that style in the future. We've also got Ready at Dawn, and to be honest, I think that these guys are perhaps one of the more realistic options available to us. They had that relationship with Sony for The Order, and they've certainly done some other third-party stuff since then. I know they released a game that was published by GameStop, I do believe, and then they've been doing some VR projects and things like that, but I do think it's fair to say they haven't had another AAA game since The Order 1886 in 2015. And I think at the moment they're kind of flying under the radar in the mind of the hardcore gamer, so I think an acquisition there is one of the more likely ones. Probably the most likely from what I've talked about so far, but still, yeah, I don't know, I think that's definitely a question mark, possible I guess, but I wouldn't bet on it necessarily either. I don't know if Sony would be interested in investing in an Order sequel necessarily, so I think if they were to be acquired, whatever exclusive game they would make would have to be a new IP again, probably. Finally, let's talk about the most likely option, and one that I know a lot of people have been talking about, and that's Remedy. Remedy's got Control coming out next month, which is pretty close, and I'm quite excited for that. They've had a relationship, or I should say had a relationship, with Microsoft for a period of time with Alan Wake, and then we had, what was it called? Quantum Break, I believe, yep, in 2014, that was an Xbox One exclusive game. And this is Remedy's first game ever? I'm not entirely sure about Remedy's history prior to Alan Wake, but it's certainly their first game in quite some time that will be available on multiple platforms, including the PlayStation 4. So there's already a huge step for Remedy and a huge change in how they're releasing their games. Control's going to be published by 505 Games, I do believe, but Sony does have marketing rights for Control, so there's already, there you go, an interesting relationship taking place there with Remedy. And Remedy's games definitely do fit in to an interesting category that seems to appeal to Sony's lineup. We know Sony loves their third-person action games for their exclusives lineup, and Remedy fits right in with those kind of games. So because of that and the marketing relationship they have with Control, I honestly wouldn't be surprised at all if Sony's kind of in talks with Remedy at the moment, and they are perhaps using Control as a bit of a test bed. I think they want to see how that game performs, and if it performs obviously commercially well, that'd be great, but I think perhaps more than anything they're interested in the critical success of Control. I think if they see that Control does critically well, if it's a hit, I would not be surprised at all within the next year if we hear about Remedy being acquired by Sony, because they would have at that point, hopefully anyway, proved themselves with Control to make these fantastic third-person action games, and I think that's something Sony's definitely would be interested in having exclusive to their platform heading into PS5. So out of all the ones I've discussed today, I think by far the most likely and perhaps the only feasible option is Remedy, and there's some clear evidence there, like I've said, with Control that seems to be pointing to something to do with that and some relationship occurring in the future with them. And I think that'd be really cool to see. But to be honest, I do have to ask the question here at the end of the video, will they acquire any studio? And I think that is honestly the most likely answer to this entire question. I think there's a distinct possibility that they just don't acquire anything. I mean, Jim Ryan simply said that they were looking into it, and I'm sure that's kind of a redundant thing to say, considering if you're a company that size and you make friggin' video games and you make consoles and you're frickin' Sony, I'm sure you're looking into that kind of crap all the time. So it's kind of a bit of non-news, I suppose, but it's fun to discuss nonetheless. So you heard it here first. I'm gonna bet, because I'm definitely not a betting person, but I'm gonna bet, hypothetically anyway, that Sony will not acquire any studios, but if they are, I think Remedy's your best shot. Let me know what studios you think Sony should or will acquire in the comment section down below. Thank you very much for watching today's video. I'll see you all next time. This has been SirCazz. Farewell.